Welcome to this month's episode of the Butterfly Pavilion Podcast. This month we feature anthropologist and professor of Georgetown, Emily Mendenhall, and author of Invisible Illness, A History from Hysteria to Long COVID. Remember to follow us on social of the media on Instagram and TikTok at Butterfly Pavilion Pod, where you can get more frequent updates on my stage 4 cancer journey and finding light in darkness. A quick episode correction. We talk about covid.org. It's actually covid.gov. Will make a lot more sense to get the insanity and jocularity. With that, please enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Butterfly Pavilion Podcast, and I'm super excited this week. We don't have Nikki. I'm not excited about that, but I am excited because we got Emily Mendenhall. Emily, I met, 2-3 years ago, as she was beginning to write her book, which is Invisible Illness, available on Amazon. Or wherever you might get your books. So this is her second book. Emily's a professor at Georgetown and author of Invisible Illness, A History from Hysteria to Long COVID. Actually, your second book, your previous book was Unmasked. I've known you for a few years. You want to say a quick hello and anything to add to that short bio that I threw out there?
Oh, sure. I'm a medical anthropologist, so I like to get into the squishy gray areas and try to think across disciplines and how people have thought and lived with illness. This is actually like my 11th book. It's just my second trade book because no one reads your academic work, really.
Okay.
So I've written a lot. Actually, I have a prehistory to writing
corrected.
about COVID. No, it's good. I have actually written a lot about trauma and diabetes and women. I spent 2 decades traveling around the world and working with women living with diabetes, mostly low-income women, and looking at how stress, trauma, and marginalization actually makes you sicker, in part because a lot of, and this is something I do talk about in part of Invisible Illness, is that, people of color, people who are lower income are less likely to go seek care until they're very, very sick, which makes their illness worse and not always, and even more invisible in some ways. And I think taking seriously race and class, ethnicity, access to insurance, and all of that complexity is such a crucial part of living with an invisible illness, which may be diabetes for people for a really long time. Because when I talk about invisible illness, it's not just about signs and symptoms, but it's really about access to healthcare and living well with an illness. So, yeah.
Right. Well, that's a good tee up for question number 6. Because we are gonna touch on the kind of the socioeconomic, because that is something that you and I talked about in the book. The book came out January, February?
January, yeah.
Yeah. So how has the year gone for you with this book? How has it been accepted? How has the year gone for you as author of Invisible Illness?
Well, Ty, you probably know this. Overall, it's been awesome. It's been really well received broadly. I wrote it very clearly so it would engage patients and physicians. I think a lot of things written just for patients are completely discarded by physicians, and things written for physicians are discarded by patients. So I was really trying to walk a fine line. I didn't talk about severe ME/CFS or really severe bedbound cases of long COVID on purpose, because I feel like those conditions are very specific and unique and particular and deserve a lot of attention. And some of those patient communities really attacked the book because they didn't think they were represented well enough. And some of the pieces of the book they didn't agree with. So that was kind of stressful. But, I think people are suffering in such a deep way that these conversations really matter, and anything that elevates patient voices and attention to people's needs and concerns is important. So that was an interesting experience. But overall, it's been great. Actually, I was just in Japan giving a talk on invisible illness, and some scholars were so excited about it, they're going to translate it into Japanese because nothing's been written on long COVID. And invisible illness is a very American Eurocentric story. And I think it needs to be seen as that, because part of it is cultural history, which is extraordinarily different in other countries. I interviewed people around the world. Actually, a lot of these stories didn't get into the book, but I interviewed I've lived in India and South Africa and Kenya, and I interviewed, my colleagues and friends from those countries. And,
Had a
you
baby in
know,
London.
and I had a baby in London. Yeah. My husband and I lived out of backpacks for quite a while before we had babies and kind of needed a job, or a stable job, rather than living on contract to contract or, postdoc money. But these these kind of narratives were like, we don't have time for long COVID. Like long COVID, there are so many urgent post-viral conditions. The ways in which we're managing these, like this linguistic kind of advocacy, doesn't even get into the health system. And I think those stories are really interesting and really different. But invisible illness, particularly, is an American story. Obviously, and if you wrote this book from a French perspective, which also has a really robust history and politic, as does UK, these three books would also be different. So I think it's important to think about it in that way too, as a cultural history.
Right, right. Well, I'm hoping you're getting your flowers. I think it might be the phrase for the book. You
Thank
also
you.
teed up one of my other questions, because I did want to like address that head on,
Hmm.
in terms of some of the feedback. But I before we even jump to that, I would encourage anyone to read the book before you
Yeah.
uh, before you perhaps jump on a line in a book or a quote in the book that you might feel doesn't suit you. Um, so you did help fill out the bingo card, because you are the first anthropologist on the
Awesome.
podcast. That's tough to say. I had a 6:15 check-in for a imaging this morning. So I'm hoping I'm cognitive and alert today.
That's
Because
early.
we've been up and going for a while here. But so you're our first anthropologist, and it's a very unique approach you take in the book, in that the first half is history. And maybe you can explain kind of why you took that approach. You talk about hysteria. Some people may not know the derivation of hysterical, because I'm assuming it comes from hysteria, and it comes from a term you talk about in the book. But you also talk about Spanish flu, long flu, which I didn't know existed until I had long COVID, because I was talking online with somebody about, well, it isn't the flu. And they corrected me as that, no, there are people that can actually have long-term viral
Hmm.
persistence
Yeah.
from even the flu. But you talk about all of these historical contexts. So maybe you can explain why you took that
Yeah.
approach and how it dovetails into how we're addressing long
Yeah.
COVID today.
Well, after studying chronic illness for, 2 decades, I ended up, during COVID, I also work in a school of international affairs. So I was deep into the global health security talk. And, one of my friends who I write about in Unmasked in chapter 1, Rebecca Katz, is, one of the leading experts on global health security. So I dug into the COVID politics, and you can't escape from it. I mean, even it lives
No,
on. Even
no,
Fauci being interviewed yesterday, which was
absolutely.
such an attack. And anyways,
I felt sorry for the poor guy,
I
honestly.
mean, he is and I know not everyone agrees, but I think he's a national hero. And the ways
I
in
do as
which
well.
he has managed medicine and the politics. I mean, just looking at how people receive my books, like the politics of being a scientist and being a loving partner to the patient community. And not everyone would agree that he was all the time, but I know him actually personally. He's a professor at Georgetown as well. And he is like a very good man. So anyway, so the
He seems
politics.
like a decent man. Seems like a good way to
Oh,
describe him.
absolutely.
As I say often online, he is not a Bond villain, although many try and paint him as such.
Yeah, anyways, that's a difficult, health politics are so crazy. And I'll tell you about my new publication, Science Politics, at the end. But so I got into this because I was writing Unmasked, because in my hometown, I like realized how powerful COVID denialism was and how embedded it was with whiteness and kind of cultural imagination of who we are and what we can do, and of body and mind and culture. And so I couldn't help writing this book. I actually wrote Unmasked in like 6 weeks. It was like in my heart mind, and it was like a loving
Wow.
critique of where I
The
grew up.
words
And
just flowed onto the paper
it just flew out.
or onto
And
the
I
screen.
actually, yeah, it just came, the book came out very quickly, in part because it just felt like such an important story. And as I was finishing Unmasked, I had a student who got really sick from long COVID. And, he was going to write a thesis with me. And I was like, well, why don't you not do that? And why don't you just start journaling, do autoethnography? So we started journaling every day, and we were in constant conversation. And Ken Kaplan, we've written in Scientific American together about brain fog. We wrote a piece on the work we ended up doing together in social science and medicine. And it was a really great introduction to long COVID. And while I was thinking and starting to read a lot about it, I started kind of putting together a project of my own. And then I actually got really sick from when I got COVID a year later. And
Right.
not like him. I actually don't even say that I have long COVID, in part because someone like you, Ty, like I couldn't even imagine my illness was the same. And I mean, still, if I get sick, it takes me like 2 months to get back running or being active, but that feels really manageable. It also feels very midlife. Who knows what it is? But there has been a significant change. But thinking about so many people with such severe conditions, they feel like such different categories. And actually thinking about that heterogeneity of what the illness is, I think makes it so tragically difficult to diagnose and understand. And that's actually was one of the reasons behind thresholds theory, which, some patients really don't like, other people really love. My research and my theory and my work came from 150 interviews with patients and providers and academics and people all over the sphere, and also deep reading of memoir. One of the great things about
Well, I should
working
point
on
out, Emily, if I may interrupt, and you tell those stories throughout the book. I always say I want empathy, not sympathy. So
yeah.
I think it's written from from an empathy standpoint of people's real stories and struggles, and those are sprinkled throughout. So I think you definitely come from a patient advocacy perspective.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
I
that
wanted to
and the book
thank you for that.
thank you, Ty. The book was written in that kind of way of thinking, much more telling stories is an anthropological craft, but the book was, I saw it more as an advocacy book, and also kind of a book that people can read and feel seen through. And that actually, I've gotten so many letters from people who have felt that way, which has been incredible. But I am answering your question. I'm just being a little circuitous.
Yeah,
um,
no. Well, no, this is great. This is what it's all about. The historical perspective, and we do tend to popcorn around on this show, so
mhm.
that's all goodness.
Yeah.
Um, what can we learn, or perhaps that's
Mhm.
history repeats itself, but maybe you
Yeah.
can explain,
Well,
why the approach of half the book is on
it's
history, but
great.
you
Yeah.
sprinkle in modern day stories.
Yeah, so I'm getting there, because as I
Sure.
experienced my own illness and I was thinking about long COVID, I'm a nerd. I feel like you and I are very similar in the way we read, we do research, we dig in, we look at it from all sides. And I just started reading and reading and reading. And so basically what came forward to me was that this is such an old story. And it's not only medical misogyny, or kind of ableism, but this is a deeply cultural story. And that's
Hmm.
why I started with Hysteria. And I thinking about like how far back dismissing women or people with chronic illness that is not inherently easy to diagnose or see has so long been part of biomedicine. And talking about medicine in that way and understanding how we are in the place that we are with medicine and patients being completely dismissed, and seeing how far back it goes, I thought was an important story to tell, because sometimes when people talk about long COVID, they were talking about it as this new condition and this new experience. But what I was so struck by while I was reading and thinking about how far back it goes is how instructive it can be to think about where this is coming from, because you can't change something overnight that's like centuries old. But I think you can address
Right.
it by deeply understanding it. And that was kind of my intention. How were these constructs, like chronic fatigue syndrome, how were these constructs created? And how is it a cultural category that is American, distinctly American, and it doesn't exist
So
other places?
so um in a kind of fascinating that was it the and I'll probably hack the name of this. Is it poliolitis where hysteria what became a thing? Was it
Oh, yeah. Well, it was so yeah, so I tell that history in a few different ways. The cultural construction of hysteria, of course, goes way back, centuries and centuries and centuries. And then kind of the work with Charcot and Freud, it became more popularized and reimagined, and it kind of detached from biological narratives or more neurological narratives and more became more psychosocial and became more weaponized against women at that moment. But and then this emergence of neurasthenia and these cultural frames emerged and kind of evolved with culture. But
Mhm.
specifically, you're talking about the royal free outbreak, I think, in 1954 in the UK.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that was a time when the idea of post viral syndromes became much more mainstream and more visible. And that also, there was also a cultural narrative of hysteria around that outbreak. But it was also a time when doctors and patients and people working in the clinic were like, no, this is clearly viral. These prolonged stories and patients who are disabled in this extraordinary way comes back discreetly to this outbreak. And that was a very powerful moment when people started to think about post-viral syndromes in a new way. And this was well beyond the great influenza, which, many historians argue is a footnote in history because of World War One. But it is this backdrop. If you
Yeah, as
even
you
look at
point out,
historical accounts of the war, yeah.
more troops were actually died from that than from battle.
Yeah. And I think it's extraordinary to also think well beyond Europe, well beyond the United States, that even in Tanzania around a bus route, this whole community was affected by flu and they were so disabled they could not plant the next year. So there's even a famine, the famine of the corns, that was linked to long flu. And having these kinds of broad global narratives and recognition of how these viruses work within the body and within communities differently is really important for understanding the breadth and experience of these viruses in people.
Yeah, it's um I remember and you know my story. So
Mhm,
I got sick so early in first quarter of 2020 and I chased, I didn't we didn't know what long COVID was until Perrigo coined the term.
mhm.
So I was doing all the traditional medicine tests, and you talk about that extensively in the book, where
Yeah.
you're chasing all these tests to try and figure out what's wrong. But it was finally at Mayo Clinic in Rochester where they actually had Dr. Greg Vanishkakorn said that this is not new. So
Mhm,
post viral illness, and of course, even that people don't like the term post viral. They Many
mhm.
prefer viral persistence. But
Yeah.
he said, post acute sequelae. This is not new.
Mhm,
And you talk about Lyme. So it's a bit of a loaded question, but we have seen this story before, right?
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the point of the book, and I think that's why when the ME community and ME long COVID community focus so much on a telling of parts of the book. It's not about ME. It's not about long COVID. It's not about Lyme. It's about the collective dismissal by medicine of these conditions that are very different, but similarly experienced in the medical system. And so I think that what the advocacy of the book itself is to medicine and speaking specifically to doctors because and actually I have a cousin who is a general, he's an internist and he's like, I really struggle with patients with complex chronic conditions that are hard to diagnose. So now I just have 20 copies of my book in your office and I give them a copy and I say, let's read this
Wow.
together. And I think that's amazing. But I think just recognizing that you are not alone in these conditions. And if you don't have a diagnosis, and the fact that very few people have one diagnosis. And that's something I learned so early on in my work with diabetes, and something that was clear as I started doing my interviews is people have a collection of diagnoses. And that's one of the reasons why long COVID itself is such a heterogeneous concept and experience, because people have these clusters of diagnoses that, I mean, and your cancer diagnosis, for example, is fundamentally shifted your incredible or your unique long COVID experience itself through medicine, physically, emotionally. I mean, that's a great example. And I think you have been so generous with your story. And I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Um, and I think it's what is it, chapter 7. I was excited to see. Well, excited. Yeah, it's hard to say. I'm excited. I'm excited to see that I was in your book to tell my tragic tale. But I appreciate that, because I think that has been my approach of uh, awareness and advocacy. And you've got a whole chapter on advocacy. So how is it that we're 6 years, 6.5 years into this thing called COVID and long COVID, and there's still gaslighting going on? I still have to explain to people what long COVID is. It's less rare to run into medical professionals, although I think 3 years in, I went to the ER, and the ER doctor had no idea what long COVID was.
Yeah.
Perhaps a loaded question, but why are we still where we're at 6 years in, and no one knows what long COVID is, and it's hard to wrap their minds around that.
I think, again, this is why telling the book from a historical perspective is so important,
Perhaps because they
because
all haven't read your book.
I don't know. You can, that's, yeah, I would love for more people to take it seriously and engage. I mean, yeah, I think it has actually been just wonderful to get so many responses of people who've been like, you explained so much to me. But what I would say is the reason why the historical narrative matters so much, and starting with Hysteria, and many people don't know about maybe they've heard of Hysteria, but not neurasthenia, and how neurasthenia was culturally crafted specifically within medicine and society through neurology, really, to think through and marginalize, but also dismiss certain categories of illness. And I think that cultural production in medicine lives on. And if you even think about how the narrative of chronic fatigue syndrome, of the construction of that really misogynist and erroneous category, was created itself in the US through kind of this cultural dismissal of even the CDC, right? Specifically,
Right.
it's embedded in the cultural medicine to dismiss and not believe, in part because of the specific focus on the body as a machine. And by not understanding the complexities of the body and of the multiple systems that engage in such a deep level, biomedicine dismisses the reality of what long COVID is and what it does. And I think that is a huge challenge. And I think that's why people are like, I don't know what long COVID is. It's not that they haven't heard of it. They're just dismissing. They're dismissing the category, and they're dismissing the need to understand complexity.
Yeah, and I think we'll touch on some of the other drivers for that, but gaslighting is alive and well, and
Yeah.
it's crazy. But you probably don't need to go much further than I don't know how I discovered this. I saw it somewhere online. COVID.org, I think, is the link, and it's a part of the CDC website, but it's a 1.5 page propaganda of the China virus and the
Oh my God.
origins of COVID.
Oh my
And of
God.
course, at the
Yeah.
very bottom, it's got the me or the famous photo of Fauci with a hand to his head,
Yeah.
and it's just
That's on the
crazy
CD
how
website now.
yeah, I believe it's COVID.org. I'll send you the link.
That's
I looped it into my.
mhm.
I don't do a lot of Substack, but I've got I've kind of shifting a bit from my blog to also putting stuff out on Substack, but it's also weaved into everything's blamed on the vaccine.
Mhm.
So you run into this where it's not long COVID, it's it's long vax, or
Yeah.
I get tired of that accusation.
Well, and
Um,
I also wonder if COVID.org, if it is managed by the CDC, is kind of organized to I mean, because the whole hearing yesterday with Fauci was about the origins of COVID. So I wonder if there's any link to that, because the implications of that hearing were really dire, or intended to be.
oh yeah, yeah, total Bond villain stuff. Um, so you mentioned in the intro, and I felt for you because there was the whole Bluesky blow up, and without naming names, I think there was an excerpt of your book that went out online, and people started to read snippets of lines of the book, and I also was like, hey, did I get this wrong? Because that's not the woman I met and interviewed with, and I think uh, again, I would encourage people to read the entire book. But I I ran into this in this discussion with our interview with David Petrino, because he had something very similar. He put out his playbook, and there was a section on graded exercise therapy in his playbook, and the internet just went mad. And uh, I think in defense, the people with long COVID, they don't have answers. They've been sick a long time. Um, I think you get some maybe out of character, but perhaps you could explain, how the book was misinterpreted. I think there was psychology. People thought
Yeah, the
it, yeah, psychological
psychologization. Yeah.
psych of long
Yeah.
COVID,
Mhm.
FND, which you clearly point out in throughout the book and in the end of the book, that the last thing you want is to have that in your medical chart,
Yeah.
because it's a very bad thing. Um, and then graded exercise therapy, which you also talk about a lot
Yeah.
in the book, and the PACE trial, et cetera. So maybe you could help
Mhm.
explain,
Yeah, what
is
happened
it
with
that,
that?
yeah, what
Mhm.
happened, and did people just not just read, a couple of lines out of the book, or how did it get so
Yeah,
sideways?
well, on the one
And I'm doing this
hand,
not to attack you. I
no, I
clearly
don't
want.
feel attacked. I don't even feel like when I was actually literally getting attacked, I wasn't angry, because why would you be angry at people who are really suffering and trying to make sense of their own experience? So I was trying to be really
Right,
loving and engage in a respectful way. That was like my intention the whole time. Okay, we disagree. I did all of this research and you and I disagree. It's okay. We don't have to agree. Um, but I do feel like some of the very online attacks specifically, and some of the one-liners that were pulled, when you tell a history book, every line isn't what I believe. I was telling a history, and
right,
some of that history, like, actually, there's a paragraph about the Pace trial that I talk about, and this was people were very angry about this one paragraph that I talk about how the Pace trial investigators went back and reran the trials and reported that they were robust, which they did. And I wasn't saying they were robust, but people were like, she says the Pace trials were robust. I'm like, no, I was reporting what the scientists said and what they did, and the Lancet has still not retracted that paper. So, and I had to tell that, because if I only told that side of the story, of the patient advocacy side, doctors would also not take the book seriously. And I think
right.
even though the book is 98% patient advocacy, there are things like that paragraph that tell the scientific story, or the physician part of the story, in part because they need to take it seriously. They need to see themselves in it to read and engage with the scholarship. And I think because people are so divided and not able to have conversations, the divisions are getting worse and patients are more isolated, and they're not taken seriously because they are so worked up because of this long history of marginalization. They are completely have a right to be worked up, and I totally understand where this, and some of the attacks on the New Wired article, which I see why people are upset if you think in this certain way, but it could be handled a little bit differently, I think, if we want dialogue. Um, and so I don't know. I think that a lot, especially some things about FND, like you mentioned, were taken out of context. And like I saw these critiques of the book, and I'm like, that I don't know what you're talking about. Like that is not what I say. That is not what I argue. But if you take a historical narrative out of context without the larger critique, I totally understand how people were seeing that. Um, and you know what? Once you put something into the world, it lives and people breathe into it and interpret it their own ways. And you have to be
Right.
secure enough in your own argument and that you did your own research to say, okay, well, this is going to live and have its own life after publication. And you have to accept that. And, you know, everyone has their own right to their own view and to use things in the ways that they need to. And I have to say, online communities also, people are trying to generate their own power and legitimacy, and so weaponizing my book also was a form in which people were creating their own legitimacy and arguments, even if their arguments I agree with, you know, largely agree with. But that's okay, that happens so often. This is just a human thing that we do.
Right. Right. Yeah. I talk about it quite a bit because there's um, of those. I mean, I tried CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mhm.
I think because it might have been recommended in my chart in one of my appointments at Mayo. And the insurance company saw that and they're like, "Oh, you need to go, do the CBT." And I went to it with an open mind, but it honestly didn't move the needle. And I know my exhaustive search
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
answers. I did brain retraining. I did all kinds of things. But the cognitive behavioral therapy, it didn't seem to move the needle for me. And
Yeah.
it also, yeah, I am one of those patients where I feel, I've got such vast, you know, physiological damage to my body. Um, I could see where patients do get defensive, and you don't do this in your
Mhm.
book, but I'm saying when people get really riled up when someone suggests it's all in your head.
Oh, and I
Um,
basically say a million times, "It's not in your head." You know, like,
oh
that's the
yeah,
point of the book. You know, this is not in
yes,
your head. This is
yes.
a real biological thing that's happening. You know, the CBT thing, Ty, I mean, I also have this perspective, like, all of my 2 kids have been in therapy. My husband and I do a ton of therapy, like, on and off when you need it. Like, I personally
I'm a
think
big fan of
people
therapy.
I love therapy. Oh my god, if I could afford therapy all the time, I would go twice a week. It's amazing. But and I think really healthy people can engage in that. But I also and people who are really suffering. But what I find with anyone who has chronic illness, for example, and there's a lot of research that especially the work on diabetes that I have known for years, within the first 1 month to 6 months of any diagnosis of a severe condition, when you're physically deeply suffering, people go through this identity transformation. And, you know, in anthropology, we might say this like perception or transition to understanding yourself in a sick role, which is a social role. But that can be extraordinarily distressing. And living and having progressive symptoms can be distressing. And in my view, therapy can be helpful for those distressing social and emotional experiences you're living with because of the illness. It's not going to fix the viral impact on your body, but we are not just physical beings. We are social and
Right,
emotional, and you know, we deal with all this structural stuff that's the backdrop of a lot of people suffering, especially
right.
in the US, which is like such a problematic health system. So, I
Yeah,
mean, yeah, go ahead.
I've,
Sorry.
I've used it. So we're kind of polar opposites in that you take a very scholastic view of things, and I quite often take a sophomoric approach to things. I love, and I've used this in some of my videos and reposts the old SNL Saturday Night Live skit, Theodoric of York Medieval Barber. And I equate that to some of the graded exercise therapy that I went
Yeah.
through, and uh, as you know, I was an avid marathon runner and triathlete,
Mhm.
and um, I knew a lot about recovery from a race and ramping
Mhm.
myself up. And I can't go out and run 20 miles the first weekend after I ran a marathon. So I felt like I knew my body. I
Mhm.
was fairly in tune with my body. But I think through Mayo and also through a local hospital, I had an open mind, and I'm like, well, maybe I just need to like start walking on a treadmill, for 2 minutes. And
Yeah.
I think the last one I went through was again at a certainly nationally known lung hospital, and I went through a PT program of graded exercise therapy. And I think it was like by the fourth or fifth session that the physical therapist, she actually says, "Hey, I think we need to stop this,"
Yeah.
because
Yeah, of course.
she saw
Mhm.
that my body was going backwards and
Yeah.
not forwards. And these weren't astronomical
Mhm.
leaps, especially for somebody that used to run very fast.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think they're lightning rod topics. So if you
Yeah.
like pull out a sentence
Yeah.
of your book, um, and as you pointed out, you cover it from a historical perspective. And I do believe you need to read the whole book, because I think by the time you read through all the patient stories,
Yeah.
you're clearly coming at it from that, patient perspective
Yeah.
and of advocacy.
And when you speak to people who are part of ME Action or Solve ME, who I have extensively talked to, it's important to recognize that graded exercise therapy is extremely dangerous for some people. And you were one of those people. On the other hand, ME or viruses that live on in your body affect people very differently. I know several people who were
Oh,
athletes
absolutely.
who
This is
have
not.
actually, yeah, no, I know you're not saying that, but I'm just
Yeah,
making the
no,
point.
the point I was going to make, and then please continue. That's part of the problem is if you have something like prostate cancer, it's a very prescriptive disease and prescriptive treatment, although it's very fluid, as we talked
Mhm.
about before we
Yeah.
started recording about potential new treatments. But
Mm.
that's part of the nature of the problem is there's very few patients that look similar. We have overlap of a
Yes.
lot of symptoms,
Yes,
but we are all
exactly.
very much different. You talk about
Mhm.
that in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a point, like, there's a one doctor I, interviewed in the book who is a big long COVID advocate and has recovered and is a long distance runner. Um, Actually, my husband says he got training syndrome or overtraining syndrome, but all of his symptoms were long COVID, and it was after a COVID infection. It's a good example of people who maybe call something some one name, but maybe it is actually affected by their persistent COVID in the body. I have a couple people I know of, one person I know very well. But I know this is something that's happened is people with heart conditions have gone into AFib. So they've had to figure out after having a COVID infection and other viral infections. So persistent viruses, not just SARS-CoV-2, can actually cause your heart, if you have an underlying vulnerability, can cause these extraordinary issues like cardiac arrest or AFib.
Right.
So recognizing the heterogeneity again of the condition is important. And I think that's important because the the PACE stuff and the CBTG, graded exercise therapy stuff is so harmful for some people, but other people have found it to be helpful. And I think that fact is what's so divisive. Because if you found it to be very harmful, you want to protect others in such a deep way. And so it's caused a rejection of those who have recovered through lots of different methods. I mean, that's the story, is that everyone recovers or finds a new semblance of balance of a new pace in completely different ways. There's not one way to do it, which I think is what makes it such a unique story, but such an important one to recognize the individualization of this experience. I don't know. I think that's why there's so much conflict around it.
Yeah, there's definitely some lightning rod phrases and words, and we've touched on a lot of
Yeah.
those. CBT,
Yeah.
get, FND.
Yeah.
Those are all acronyms that we're well familiar with in the long COVID community that
Mhm.
tee people off. Um, So I guess moving on a bit, my uncommon story that you cover in chapter 7, and we talked about this
Mm,
during our conversations and interviews and what landed in the book, and that is the socioeconomic nature and cruelty of long COVID. I was, you know, a white male with a lucrative job, and although I would give credit to my wife because I've actually got a good blog post on this, and like what are the navigational moves you need to make when navigating disability. Um, I was fortunate, as you know, that I filed for
mhm,
FMLA,
mhm.
which gave me some protections while I was still employed. And then I went to HR, and they encouraged me to file for short-term disability. So I had a much better path. And you tell a lot of heartbreaking stories about people that don't have that situation. So I was able to keep my home. Um, I know of a couple people that live on the street with long COVID because they've lost everything. So I think there's different strata. There's
Yeah.
the economic piece you talk about in your book, gender, even sexual orientation, race, all plays into it. Maybe you could speak to that
Yeah.
for a little bit, and kind of the breadth of stories that you came across. Because I sometimes use the word lucky, but then I counter that with, you can't feel too lucky getting long COVID and then cancer.
Mhm.
But I've had a more fortunate outcome than many others.
Yeah, and biomedicine itself is like built on white supremacy. So like thinking about how our racial hierarchies in the US exist, like I use your story and other white people's stories and Peter Brown, one of my mentors, and I just want to say that you and Peter were so courageous to let me use your stories of what you can do when you have access to money. And I think spelling that out, especially to American readers about how inequitable our system is so important because if you have all the money in the world, not that you have all the money in the world, but if you have access, you were able to get disability quickly, which, so many people are like, I can't get disability. One woman, and I talk about this in the same chapter as yours, was like, my lawyer thinks I should just become homeless because I'll be more likely to get disability, even though I'm already living with my father who's pretty abusive to me. Like these
Yeah,
stories are so present and so common, but providing your story and Peter's story, who had the Guillain-Barré condition where he was completely disabled and on a ventilator, telling those stories and telling what visibility does and telling what money does is so important to show what is possible. And it should be an equitable thing that everyone has access despite having these severe conditions. Everyone should be able to do, the therapies to see what works for them and to do participate in studies, but it's just not the case. And you had a lot of courage to let me use your story. And your blog has been so instructive for so many people. So I wanted to thank you for that.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. It doesn't. It still doesn't mean that I myself or Peter, because um, you talk about his story in your book, and um, it still doesn't lessen the fact that we were chronically ill.
Yeah,
We had our lives taken away from us.
exactly.
I thought I was going to lose my home,
Yeah.
and I I was a driver from third grade,
Mhm.
where I was collecting cans and digging hangers out of the dumpsters to sell to the dry cleaners,
Mhm.
and that carried me through my whole career. And I saw the
Mhm.
potential for it all to tumble
Yeah. Mhm.
like a house of cards. So I had different stresses. I mean,
Absolutely.
losing a home f- that I'd worked my entire life to be in a position where we are today. Um, but I also in the same breath do consider myself fortunate like I said, because I've
Mhm.
got friends living on the street.
Mhm.
It is
Yeah.
heartbreaking.
But your story, even someone with means who has built their way up to have a comfortable life, the fact that you were concerned of for losing your house shows how problematic the system is, right? It shows how we just
Right.
keep stretching and taking away safety nets for our humanity, for our country. And that is something that really needs to change. Actually,
And it's only getting
yeah,
worse, by the
it's
way.
getting worse.
I was
It's
reading yesterday
yeah.
that they're considering um, putting provisions in Medicare, not Medicaid, that people with cancer should go to work just
It's just getting
unilaterally.
so much worse. It's really actually so upsetting. If anyone is interested in just having a deep think about the health system, I have this new publication, Science Politics. Go to sciencepolitics.org. And Sanjay Basu, who is an epidemiologist and physician, has been writing these incredible essays on the health system. And I would encourage anyone to read them. I think they are brilliant. And we're going to put together a special collection so you can read them all together. But he has a column that he publishes monthly. So I would encourage people to take a look at those. I think they're so good. And we have another history of health insurance in the US. And we're just trying to really critically dig at what is going on and what is possible within this pretty problematic system.
Right, right. Um, so we talked a lot about Anthony Fauci already. So how did we get there? I mean, and I talk about this, and that the first president pretended like it wasn't a problem at all, and then Biden came in and pretended it was gone entirely. It just so are you seeing this around the world, or how did we get to the point where it's almost like
Yeah.
you wouldn't question cancer or leukemia form of cancer, or name your XYZ
Yeah.
disease? It's been well defined for a long time. Um, this has become so political, where to the point where a certain side of the aisle believes that COVID is a cold, and long COVID is a joke. Like it's not believed at all. So
Well,
it's
I would
shocking that that became a part of our fabric of culture.
Yeah, and I would frame that, as, like, an active process of forgetting that's happening right now, and, I actually had a really amazing conversation with some of my I gave this talk in June in Tokyo, and, I write about it on my Substack, but, I found it to be so interesting in part because people are talking about really framing and actively having these conversations about what people are doing to actively forget, and at this moment when everyone knows about long COVID, especially if you're in medicine, like, it's been all over the news. You're living under a rock if you haven't heard of it. But there is, I think, an active process of forgetting or dismissing that people are undergoing culturally, that is really complicated, and that's a cultural process, and I don't have a great analysis of why or what's happening, um, but I would agree with you that that's what's happening, and people are aggressively doing this, and it may be a political move. I definitely think it's a political move in some ways because people are, want to erase suffering and say, "Oh no, things are getting better. Things are good. This is a rosy side. You should vote for me. You should support me." So I definitely think that is happening. Um, but yeah, the processes that are happening in medicine are interesting, and I don't have a great analysis of that process of forgetting of
Yeah,
where it's coming from and how it's crafted yet.
and it's maybe a question more out of frustration,
Yeah.
and it's crazy that it also is become, which side of the aisle you sit on depends
Yeah.
on whether or not you even believe, it exists. But um, it's just insanity, um, and it's getting worse, as we say.
Yeah.
Um, so um, we talk about on the podcast about finding light in darkness, and
Hmm.
before we hit record, I said that long COVID is a depressing topic, and so we talk for 50 minutes about something very depressing, and how do you find the light at the end of the tunnel? For me, I think cancer was the thing that
Hmm.
actually was a bit of a breakthrough for me.
Hmm.
I just also recently read Suleika Jihad's book, Between Two Kingdoms. I'd highly recommend it for someone
Thank
going
you.
through cancer or a
Yeah.
caregiver for someone with cancer. Um, and I finally just had a breakthrough where and you talk about this repeatedly through your book, of where you finally need to have some level of acceptance for, this is my life and how do I live within the
Hmm.
constraints of that.
Yeah.
You give stories of a woman who went on, deep relaxation periods, or I can't remember what term you used, but she would
Which
sleep
was
for.
very controversial for some people.
Well, but I do
But
that
it,
in
yeah,
a micro sense,
so do
because I've
I.
adjusted my lifestyle to where my daughter knows that between 2 and 4:30, dad's likely asleep,
Yeah, right.
because that's usually my crash part of the day. But it's also a recharging of my battery so I can have dinner with my wife. So
Yeah.
I, without getting too sappy, I think cancer, I finally said, I can no longer, I talked about this in a previous episode. It was a woman that was on America's Got Talent, and she had cancer. And backstage, she had a quote where she said, "I can't wait for things to get better to choose to be happy."
Hmm.
And not every day is that day for me. I have bad days. I still cry. You've got despondent moments, but you do talk about that. You wrap it up at the tail end of your book, I feel, in that um, you need to find a way to live within the constraints of what you have. And maybe that was another controversial part of the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
But
Well, I
maybe
think you
you
have,
can talk to
yeah.
how you wrapped up the book,
Yeah.
and how do people live with long COVID?
Well, I think you already kind of demonstrated one of the main points. So one of my arguments throughout the book is that we live in this culture of productivity and efficiency. It makes it incredibly hard when you have an energy limiting condition, whatever the condition is, to claim space, to create a life and a world that fits you, that suits you, that you can live well in. If you need a 2-hour nap in the middle of the day, that is excellent. You should take it every single day if you can. And
It's
trying to
also hard.
orient,
It's also hard to find a spouse all the time, that, because you talk
well,
about
can
stories in
care
the
for
book
you.
where
Yeah.
the woman with her father, where he looks at her like she's lazy. And I've got an incredible support infrastructure with my
Yeah.
wife, my family, my kids. But I'm sorry I cut you off.
No,
But
no, but your case is so exemplar of how to fight against this culture of productivity and efficiency. So my argument of being able, like what I loved about Nell, who you mentioned, the nurse who got COVID 5 times, was so debilitated, she couldn't work, she couldn't care for anyone, she couldn't care for herself. So she just, I mean, and she wasn't super wealthy, but she basically said, I have to get well. And she dismissed everyone and everything. I think her daughter went with her. And she like sat on a beach in Mexico. She's like, my body had to reset. I just needed to get away
right,
from everything. And part of it is rejecting these cultural ideas of always being busy, of always doing something, and being okay with finding what your rhythm is and what you want to do and what you need. And so I think what I like about her story is that she rejected this culture of harm and found a new normal in a way that really provided her an ability to heal. And whatever that healing is or however it goes, she did find healing, and it was a path towards recovery, and it was a path that she still is working on. But I think a lot of people are just kind of actively healing and recovering as they live their lives, and that's really hard. But part of the critique is just, working against this notion that you should be well, you should have all of this energy for everything all the time, this is expected to produce. And so pushing against that is one of the hardest things I think that people
and
face also.
that's also not saying that going to a beach on Mexico will cure you.
Right.
uh,
No, of course
right?
not. Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Um,
obviously that's not gonna cure you.
no,
It's a
no,
yeah.
no. I'm just talking about the ridiculous of taking a line out of a book
Oh, yeah.
and saying, "Oh, well, she's suggesting this."
Oh, no.
Um,
No.
I think it's a good. I want to end with two things, and one is a quote at the end of the book that I liked from Invisible Illness. As I have argued throughout the book, recovery from complex chronic illness is not about a cure because there is none. Although some people go into remission, rather, it's about reestablishing a new baseline and pace in life, about remaining what good life means while managing waves of illness. Um, and that to me is, at least for me, dovetails right into this sappy finding light in darkness, and having to figure out how to live with this thing. That
Yeah,
does not mean giving up. So if
of course.
cancer right now, life saving and life extending, it remains a priority. I still see doctors about some of my sub diagnosis, including neuropathy, etc. So it doesn't mean give up, but it does mean how do you enjoy a dinner or a sunset,
Mhm.
and it's hard to do because I know people are bedbound, um, but at least for me, I try I try and find uh, how do I live with the cards in my hand.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Um, yeah, and I think we all do. I mean, I have lived with anxiety all of my life, and it changes throughout my life, and I have to manage it in really different ways. And sometimes it's helpful for me, and sometimes it's incredibly harmful. And that's a very different condition than long COVID. But I think when you live with a chronic illness, you have to learn how your body functions because there's not one story or one prescription that's going to cure everyone. We are so different. We have
Right,
different
right,
bodies, different communities, different resources. We live in different countries. I mean, the first book I ever wrote, the first monograph I ever wrote was called Syndemic Suffering. And I worked at Cook County Hospital for 5 years. And I worked with Mexican immigrant women, many who are undocumented. And in that book, I talk about how the stress of undocumentation, of being perceived to be illegal, or to have a loved one who's undocumented, how that stress can make you so sick, it worsens your diagnosed condition. And thinking
right,
about the current environment we're living in, especially people who are living with long COVID, who are undiagnosed, do not have access to healthcare, are not going to a health clinic because they do not feel safe seeking care in a health clinic because of ICE or other conditions. It's just, those are the people I'm most worried about right now because I think so many people are suffering and are in pain and don't know how to get well in a system that is so broken. And that is one of the main points of invisible illness. And I hope that
right.
doesn't get lost.
No, no, I don't. It didn't with me. Reading the book. Um, I want to end with a tradition we have here on the Butterfly Pavilion podcast, and that is movie quotes. It's funny because the first guest we had on was Akiko Awasaki,
Oh, nice.
and she's so polished and professional, as
Mhm.
are you. And I'm like, God, is she gonna uh, how do I pose this movie quote thing to someone so scholarly? But she was a great sport, as was Petrino. I don't think I gave one to Jonathan Howard, but I've got a quick one for you. To be on the wire is life. The rest is waiting.
Hmm. That's not from The Wire, is it?
Well, you referenced the song "All That Jazz," so that is a quote from the
Oh,
movie "All That
yeah.
Jazz" from
Nice.
Gideon, who was played by Roy Scheider in the movie. One of my favorite actors from Jaws, which is one of my top movies. But Emily, it's been an absolute delight to have you on the tail end of this experience, having been interviewed with you. Or having been interviewed by you for the book. I thank you and appreciate you having my story in the book, because I think it's important for us as storytellers to tell our story to advance, hopefully more treatment, more cure. But any closing comments today?
Oh, the best part of doing research and being a researcher, I always joke that I'm an anthropologist because I'm very nosy. But I love people, and being able to connect with you and many other people who, I mean, we didn't just have one interaction. We talked a few times, and we also texted and emailed several times. And I mean, there's
You
many
made
people
sure that I was able to edit what was going to wind up being on paper,
of
or
course,
be
of
okay with
course.
what was going to be on
Yeah,
paper.
everyone in the book reviewed multiple times what was said
Right.
about them, and that's really important to me. But the best part of doing this research is meeting incredible, inspiring people and learning from people and being able to share their stories for a broad audience. So thank you for that privilege, and it's just been wonderful. And yeah, thank you for having this opportunity to chat with you.
Super. Well, it's been great to catch up. So with that, we'll sign off from the Butterfly Pavilion podcast.